All right, our format for today will be a brief overview of our 11 trends in philanthropy, followed by a discussion with three distinguished panelists, Elisha Smith Arrillaga, Vice President of Research from the Center for Effective Philanthropy, Victoria Vrana, CEO of GlobalGiving, and Glen Galaich, CEO of the Stupski Foundation. This is our 10th annual trends report, which means we've now written 110 articles since we started this work in 2017. You can find them all at johnsonCenter.org/trends. This year we took a different approach to our trends report. Rather than identifying wholly new trends, we turned our attention backward to reflect on the themes that have shaped our sector over the past decade and to name both enduring shifts and new developments. This reflective lens isn't just about our anniversary, it's an acknowledgement of the moment we find ourselves in. A moment of hyper-disruption that combines great anxiety about where we're headed with great possibility for what could come next. Our future feels more uncertain than ever, but the opportunity to create and scale life-changing innovations for our communities feels present as well. With that, let's dive into our trends for this year. We're opening this year's report with a focus on public trust because it's so fundamental to our daily work and to the sector's very ability to function and exist. The data here are concerning. Our own research at the Johnson Center found a 7% decline in public trust in the nonprofit sector just between March and September of 2025. Similar findings from independent sector and the Edelman Trust Institute show this is a real and growing problem. Here's what's interesting about trust. Edelman's Trust Barometer measures two dimensions: trust in a sector's ethics and trust in its competence. The public generally views nonprofits, especially local ones, as ethical, but they see real weaknesses in our competence. Of the four sectors that Edelman tracks, government, media, NGOs, and business, only business is viewed as both ethical and competent. In other words, we're losing ground. Part of the challenge is that competence is hard to measure in our sector. Our outcomes are often long-term and intersectional. A charitably funded playground contributes to healthy children, but it doesn't solely determine that outcome. So organizations like the Council on Foundations, National Council on Nonprofits, and funders like Vanguard Charitable are increasing their efforts to improve storytelling about our sector's real achievements and to help us use more accessible, less politically charged language to describe what we do. Next, AI adoption is accelerating everywhere. Gallup reported that the percentage of U.S. workers using generative AI at work jumped from 21% to 40% in just 2 years. Among nonprofit employees specifically, 58% say their organizations are using AI regularly. This isn't a new trend for us. We've written about AI's trajectory in the philanthropic workforce in previous years. But what we're seeing now is the field coalescing around the need for clear, effective policies at both the organizational and sector-wide level. Groups like the Technology Association of Grantmakers are helping us move forward with frameworks for use, rather than just strict rules, and they're encouraging funders to support grantees in developing their own policies and practices. The concerns are real: data reliability, environmental impact, and the particular challenge for organizations whose missions are tied to these issues. If you're working in climate justice, you have to grapple with whether any AI use is acceptable, given its environmental footprint, at least for now. Next, the crisis in journalism continues. Just last week, the Washington Post laid off 30% of its workforce, 300 of its 800 journalists. The defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting eliminated $1.1 billion from the public radio and television ecosystem, destabilizing hundreds of stations and forcing layoffs, budget cuts, and emergency fundraising. Rural and tribal communities are especially at risk. But there's reason for some optimism. The Public Media Bridge Fund aims to raise $100 million over 2 years to support 115 of the most vulnerable stations. Individual station campaigns raised $70 million more in 2025 than in 2024 from at least 180,000 new donors. But that's not enough to fill the gap. Rising censorship, legal challenges, and long-term financial instability all underscore that 30 years after Craigslist helped catalyze the decline of media revenues, we still don't have good answers for journalism's business model this century. The boundaries between business and government have been blurring for a decade. We all know the examples. Ben & Jerry's, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Tom's Shoes, and more recent high-profile shifts, like OpenAI's restructuring and for-profit news outlets operating charitably funded initiatives like The Guardian and The New York Times. These hybrid models, charitable LLCs, B Corps, social enterprises, have gained popularity because of their flexibility. What intrigues us is how the tension between profit motives and social missions will evolve in the coming years. Government funding has typically filled resource gaps in areas like affordable housing and food security, where market solutions may not exist. Without that government funding, business and philanthropy will need to work together even more closely to sustain essential services. This could be an area for hope if necessity is the mother of invention. An era of enormous innovation could be on the horizon. We've been inspired in recent years by the growing presence of new structural and leadership models in our sector. Co-leadership, fiscal sponsorship, hybrid organizations. In some ways, this rise has helped prepare us for the extremely difficult choices we're facing today. The numbers are striking. In 2023, Social Impact Commons found that twice as many fiscal sponsorship programs were established in the previous 20 years than in the 40 years before that. This growth means more people are familiar with the concept and there are more robust networks available to help, just when more organizations need new structural solutions. Because our nonprofits are in crisis, nearly 1/3 experienced government funding losses in 2025. 46% of surveyed nonprofit leaders are concerned they may have to close their doors. In CEP's report published just this month, nearly 30% of nonprofits reported cutting services in 2025, even as 80% reported increased demand. We're preparing research on the state of play when it comes to mergers, acquisitions, partnership models, and alternatives to simply closing your doors. We look forward to sharing that with the field later this spring. As climate disasters intensify, grassroots organizers, indigenous leaders, and youth movements are driving community-rooted climate solutions despite daunting challenges. In March 2025, the EPA rolled out a 31-point plan to reduce environmental regulations and rescind at least $29 billion in climate-related grants. Climate funding and philanthropy remains highly concentrated. Just 5 funders provided more than 40% of funds, and a fifth of that went to just 5 organizations. But community-led networks are advancing systemic, justice-centered strategies for resilience and long-term recovery as federal support recedes. Youth advocates are securing landmark legal precedents in states like Montana and Hawaii, and there are signs of hope. Research from the Redstone Strategy Group showed that community-led climate efforts produced more effective and cost-efficient results than national and global initiatives. At COP30 last November, the Forest Tenure Funders Group pledged an additional $1.8 billion by 2030. This is the trend that makes everything else so unpredictable. Government philanthropy relations fractured in 2025 as political shifts, funding instability, and legal challenges force nonprofits to confront a future where they may need to operate despite government rather than alongside of it. Long-standing pillars of our work environment have shifted. The Johnson Amendment, which prohibits nonprofits from endorsing specific candidates, is once again up for debate. Widespread funding disruptions destabilized nonprofit operations and increased community needs. And here's the stark reality. Our own analysis showed that in 2025, federal expenditures were just over $7 trillion. All assets held by private and community foundations in this country only equal $1.66 trillion. Dollar for dollar, philanthropic assets would run out 86 days into one federal budget year. We cannot replace the scale or role of government services. Amid these pressures, the sector is turning toward advocacy, coalition building, and renewed engagement with policymakers, reflected in campaigns defending philanthropic freedoms and the relaunch of the Congressional Philanthropy Caucus. Federal data sets have disappeared in droves over the past year. Some have reappeared, some by court order, and some now include disclaimers from the Trump administration. But we all rely on valid, accessible data to make decisions, chart strategies, and track progress. In response, data rescue efforts have emerged across the sector, especially among higher education and research groups trying to capture and save existing data sets, or develop alternative sources for health, education, climate, and community needs. In an era of declining public trust, this loss of data, combined with AI-driven bias risks, requires far greater transparency and responsible data practices. We need to build new systems for data access, ethical use, and community-centered storytelling to guide our work. According to research cited by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, nonprofits announced plans to cut over 28,000 jobs by November of last year, an increase of over 400% from the year before. The real number is almost certainly far higher. We don't have good data on organizational closures or the nonprofit workforce in general, but we know that going into 2026, 22% of nonprofit workers already struggled to meet their basic needs. Burnout is widespread, and the CEP report shows a huge perception gap as well. 93% of foundation leaders say foundations' response to understanding grantees' challenges is moderately or very effective. Only 54% of nonprofit leaders said the same. Well-being is complex and incredibly variable. Each person, each organization, each network may define it differently. But we know you're supposed to put your own oxygen mask on first. While more funders are beginning to support staff well-being, the sector must prioritize care, structural innovation, and long-term resilience to withstand ongoing volatility. Associational life has been core to American culture since its founding. Alexis de Tocqueville described 1830s America as a place where people form associations for no matter how small a matter. We band together to address community challenges, build connections, and make change. But rising political violence, executive actions targeting groups like the Ford Foundation and Open Society Foundations, and rising scrutiny of giving behavior have created a new climate of fear for donors, threatening civil society participation. Scholars like Lucy Bernholtz note that giving has always been inherently political, especially given its relationship to the tax code and the blurring boundaries between political, economic, and social actions. Yet nonprofits and communities desperately need resources. Nonprofits are urging donors to stay engaged through unrestricted support, early pledge payments, and collective action. Increased giving today may help resource innovation for tomorrow. In this final trend, we did our most expansive reflection. We sought to understand how the field as a whole has shifted over the past decade and may continue to shift in the months and years ahead. In many remarkable and uplifting ways, philanthropy is shifting from elite institutional-driven models towards participatory, collective, and digitally enabled forms of generosity as people search for connection, shared power, and new ways to mobilize resources. Collective giving, especially in communities of color, has become a mainstream force that redistributes decision-making power and expands who participates in philanthropy. Digital tools like GoFundMe and Grapevine are transforming donor engagement while also introducing risks tied to algorithmic control and misinformation. In an era of rising isolation, political division, and declining trust, we need to remember the imperative need for community, for connection, for generosity and humanity in our lives. At the Johnson Center, we've been talking about the value of simply hosting friends and neighbors more often for dinner or coffee, anything that increases how we know and see one another. At the end of the day, philanthropy is about a love of humanity. Again, you can find this report and all of our previous trends reports at johnsoncenter.org/trends. Now I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Elisha Smith-Arrillaga leads the research team at Center for Effective Philanthropy, overseeing the development and analysis of major studies addressing the philanthropic sector's most pressing challenges. A former faculty fellow and professor of philanthropic practice and education policy, Dr. Smith-Arrillaga is a frequent speaker and advisor, contributing to national conversations on equity and innovation, including serving on Google's Emerging AI Research Roundtable. Next, Glen Galaich is the CEO of the Stupski Foundation, where he leads the foundation's spend-down strategy. A longtime leader in strategic philanthropy, Glen previously served as CEO of the Philanthropy Workshop, worked with the Global Philanthropy Forum and Human Rights Watch, and now continues to contribute to building our field as host of the podcast Break Fake Rules and author of the Why Gives newsletter. We hear a new book is also in the works. And finally, Victoria Vrana is the CEO of GlobalGiving and a senior leader in innovation and philanthropy, bringing extensive experience from her previous role as Deputy Director of Philanthropic Partnerships at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She has held leadership positions at Venture Philanthropy Partners, the Marino Institute, and Millennium Communications, and now serves on the boards of the Washington Area Women's Foundation and the PayPal Giving Fund. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you three. So to start us off, as our trends report looks back at the sector over the past decade, it's clear that this past year has been one of seismic shifts and disruptions to business as usual. As our opening question, I'd just like you to share from your point of view, what has changed the most and what do you feel has stayed the same? And I see Glen up on the screen, so why don't we start with you, Glen?
Well, thank you. It's really an incredible honor to be here with both the panelists and with you, Elizabeth and Elisha. I've just been so impressed with your most recent report at CEP. I've been telling everybody about it and fretting about it horribly. And I'm afraid that my peers haven't brought the same kind of concern, which is where I come from on all these comments. So I will respond by focusing really on foundations because that's where I spend my time. And that's where I pay most, close attention. I think the most interesting reaction to the disruption in 2025, and let's be clear what it was, a total government retreat from the social sector like we haven't seen before. And threats, lots of threats, many of them not, coming to fruition. But the foundation sector, which is made up of 150,000 private foundations, which I'm not sure we always grasp how large this sector is, Of that, I would say 500, which is such a small amount, but it almost feels like our universe. But 500 of them, I'd say, have been in really close coordination in 2025 through various mechanisms. Some we can talk about, some we can't. And so that was a real plus. And I think what was really important of that, in that coordination, is that in the early stages of Trump's attack on us, that group worked really well to fend off existing executive orders and possible executive orders. So I thought that was a really impressive thing. But the downside is it kind of also led to what I perceive as a trend that's been around for decades, which is a lot of foundations decided to, I'd say most of those foundations leaned into a culture of protection and safety. And by that, I mean not calling their lawyers and asking how they protect themselves, really locking hard onto the funds that exist in our endowments. And so, what you see in this trends report, which is really important information, is the level of loss and fear and disruption that's showing up for nonprofits. And Elisha's report shows in a survey just the deep fear and loss that's going on across the sector. And what Elisha's report also shows us is that foundations are not feeling that. They are not feeling it. And even when asked about the report, there have been some recent responses from foundations, largest foundations, I'll say, that want to focus on kind of the nuances of the report than the main message of both this trends report and CEP's report, which is we need to start moving money, more money than we've ever had to move before. That's not happening. And that, I think, is just an ongoing trend that continues. Most foundations have reacted by moving 1% to 2% more this year. And I just find that frustrating personally, but it is a trend that continues. We have not found a way in the midst of disruption in the foundation sector to respond to crisis on a level that the crisis is felt by the nonprofit sector. And I think in a lot of ways, it's why trust has become just an ongoing challenge.
Thanks, Glenn. Let me turn to Victoria. What has the sort of response been for you on the ground? Trends that continue, trends that are new, but especially in the global space.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. So glad to be with you all today. Amazing to be with my fellow panelists. I'm here to learn and listen as much as I am to share kind of our experience at Global Giving. And also, I want to share kind of my experience from 30 years in the sector. When it's been a while, you start seeing things kind of come back around or things go, the new things that are newly discovered that maybe started 20 years ago. And so that's when I think about trends. I think more of forces almost. We're not the
Hmm.
most we're trendy in our language, but we kind of have ongoing forces in the sector. And I think Glenn is talking about one of those, right? Foundations playing it safe and protecting their everything, their reputations, their assets, their whatnots. Some of the other trends I have seen that are positive over a long time or forces are this shift to more trust-based, flexible funding. And that's one of those things that people started talking about a good 20 years ago that was like a big new idea, funding operating funds, multi-year grants. That was kind of radical a while ago, and now is kind of common knowledge, if not action. And I think the action's increased over the years, still not anywhere where it should be, but definitely the conversation is had by all. And so that's kind of encouraging. I feel like we're making progress there. Um, local funding, place-based funding, community-led funding, that's a big thing for us at Global Giving. We're very focused on powering community change makers. And in the global space, you saw a big shift towards localization. Again, a lot of talk about how that's important, but some real movement towards some real targets. And I'll tell you, that's one of the forces I'm terribly afraid of us losing in this moment. And I'll talk about why in a sec. One other kind of force, though, in our sector that I want to call out that's been going for at least 20 years is the rise of intermediaries. So you have community foundations, you have donor advised funds, you have platforms like Global Giving, lots of folks in the middle, collaborative funds, pooled funds, mega funds. And that's a very important kind of force to keep an eye on because in many ways, they make things expedient for donors and they can have all kinds of benefits. But in other ways, they can sometimes make it difficult for nonprofits to build relationships directly with their donors. And so, for those of us who are intermediaries like Global Giving, we got to think about how to do that responsibly. So when I get to the disruptions of last year, I mean, when you think about global kind of issues, it was incredibly, what is the word I want to even look for? Destructive what happened in overseas development assistance. You know, the Lancet Global Health estimates that up to 2 million deaths will occur by 2030 that are avoidable. And that's the part I cannot get past. You know, we can talk about reinventing a broken system, and we will, and we have, and we shall, but lives are being lost right now. And there are amazing organizations that are positioned to save those lives and had been working diligently to save those lives. I mentioned being concerned about localization, and what's happening in the emergency funds that are trying to flow to these organizations is that for expediency's sake, they're often going to large INGOs based in the US. And that's not a bad thing. But the local grassroots organizations are really being left out a lot of these funds. And so that's part of where global giving comes in. Like that's what we're laser focused on is how we get dollars to those funds. I mean, the other kinds of things seeing from the disruption of last year are a lot of talk about mergers and acquisitions. Again, not as much action as we could see, but lots of hope of organizations trying to kind of connect with others. And I'll save some thoughts for further on. I want to make sure Elisha gets to jump in here.
Thank you, Victoria. Elisha, I think mergers and acquisitions are a nice transition point to the work that you've been doing with CEP. What's it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, Elizabeth. And thanks so much, Glenn, for the continuing to get the word out about the report. Our hope too is that folks are using that data to think about changes they want to make in their practice. Because in the CEP data, I would say, we gathered this data last fall, September of last year. And what we see in that data in terms of what's changed is that the scale of the crisis is just fundamentally different. So that survey, which was a representative survey of for more than 400 nonprofits and more than 200 foundations, we found that almost 2/3 of nonprofits reported an increased demand for services, as Elizabeth stated. At the same time, nearly 70% of nonprofits experienced a reduction in funding from the government or other private funding sources. But to put that in context, because we've been asked this a lot when we share this data, folks still say, well, is it really that different from how things have been in the past? And our data actually shows that it is. So when we asked nonprofits in February 2021 during the COVID-19 pandemic whether they saw an increased demand for their services in 2020 relative to the year prior, only 50% said that they had. So the increase in demand for nonprofits' work and the services they provide in 2025 is far beyond at least what we saw in that data, some during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what stayed the same is that despite the challenges that nonprofits are facing, we did a series in addition to the surveys. We did interviews with both foundation leaders and nonprofit leaders from around the country, 60 interviews. And what stayed the same is nonprofits' creativity, their resilience, their face of, just their ability to be flexible and find a way in spite of the context. And so, for instance, whether that includes things like mergers or acquisitions or thinking creatively about new funding partners, we heard examples from nonprofits of doing all kinds of those sorts of things to ensure that they can still provide the essential services they're providing in communities, whether that's meals to the hungry or shelter for people. That nonprofits are being creative and trying to find ways to provide those services, even in spite of the challenges that they're facing at this moment.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives there. I'm going to kind of go in reverse order this time. So, Elisha, we were talking about your recent research that you just released, and Glen really highlighted this kind of perception gap of what the situation is like for nonprofits versus foundations. What was your biggest takeaway from or insight from that work, and what are you hoping that others will take away from it?
Well, one of the biggest takeaway was just we asked foundations and nonprofits the same question around several items, but one of the items was around we asked foundations, do how well do you think you understand the challenges that your grantees are facing? And 93% of foundations, or around 90%, said, we think we have a really good understanding of the challenges. And only that number for nonprofits, when we ask them the same question, is only around 50%. And the interesting thing there too is we asked that same question in 2014, and that discrepancy was not there at all. Both were much
Mm,
closer to the middle. And so what strikes me from that data that's really problematic is what do we think we're trying to solve the same problems? If we have a
mm,
different understanding of what the challenges are, then I would argue maybe we need to be in deeper conversation with one another about the issues that are actually happening in communities, what people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's interactions with ICE or other implications for healthcare. But there just seems to be a disconnect between what is happening in communities and what funders at this moment, at least based on the data that we just gathered, which is nationally representative of all foundations that do more than $5 million in grant making. But just a disconnect between like the challenges that are occurring and, the understanding of that. It seems to be kind of
yeah.
passing, strangers passing in the night, so to speak.
Well, Victoria, you started sharing about the global aid ecosystem and, of course, all of the major changes last year. How has community philanthropy stepped up, and do you feel like the larger institutional funders have done the same, or are you actually seeing what Alicia shared play out kind of in real time?
Yeah, so the insight from the research is so important, Alicia, and it really speaks to how we need to change philanthropy still, and how that relationship between funders and their donors and their nonprofit recipients are so important. Like you have to be in relationship with one another. If you're in relationship, you're solving the same problems, right? So when we look at the global piece, I mean, here's the bottom line. Like philanthropy can't replace government aid. There's no way. So the US gave $64 billion in aid in 2023, and foundations recently gave $8 billion. So it's just not nothing, but it's nowhere near the same magnitude. Where the numbers still aren't out from last year, I don't know that we have an institutional surge. We at Global Giving saw a little bit of an increase with individuals. I know, and there were a number of efforts, bridge efforts around the country that mobilized at least $100 million, right? Which is great. $100 million could go an incredibly long way, especially in many of these countries, but it's not going to fill a $64 billion gap, right? And so the thing is, we're going to have to kind of completely change what we do. And organizations, are going to have to change their funding models. And part of the challenge is small grassroots organizations don't have that resiliency to pivot so quickly. It's one thing to say, oh, go start raising money online, go get money from high net worth donors, try to have some revenue, and to kind of make that pivot overnight. If you don't have a cushion, very difficult to weather that. It's the same thing with mergers and acquisitions. If you don't have the know-how and the capital to invest in that, it's pretty tough to do. I think community philanthropy will be one little part of the solution. And that's the key thing here. There's not going to be a single silver bullet. It's going to take lots of different streams of capital and financing to be able to rebuild this system. And so it's going to take impact investing. It's going to take an increase from foundations. It's going to take an increase from corporate philanthropy. It will take platforms like ours that can connect folks to diaspora donors and help them raise money online. And it needs to be this concentrated effort. At Global Giving, we launched a fund, the Community Aid Fund, to get emergency support to our nonprofit organizations. We mobilized about $28 million altogether. So we're excited about that. But we all the know-how and the tools for organizations to be able to pivot are going to be just as important as anything else in this kind of finding these new solutions.
Yeah. And I think like you said, nothing happens overnight, right? And yet nonprofits are often expected to respond overnight, right? So
Yep.
holding both of those. I think a question just came in for you specifically, Victoria, and then I'll ask Glenn a question. Does the figure of government funding to nonprofits include things like tuition and loans to nonprofit colleges and universities?
I'd have to look at our data specifically, and I can get back to you on that. I doubt it. I mean, we're really talking about like traditional foreign aid is where that number comes from,
Okay,
the 64 billion, but I can check with a colleague and see.
thanks. Well, Glenn, our trends report highlighted things like rising polarization, attacks on democratic norms, and growing pressures on institutions that hold power accountable. From your vantage point as a foundation CEO, how do you decide when and how philanthropy should step into the democracy protection space?
Well, unfortunately, I think that question is about 10 years old. And we still haven't figured out how, as a community, to do it. I don't think we'd be in the situation we're in if philanthropy had figured out how, or foundations in particular, had figured out how to move more aggressively in protecting democracy. First of all, I just want to say one thing. You did hint at the book, so I'll tell you the book's title and the book because it applies exactly to what I'm about to say. I have a book coming out on March 17th called Control: Why Big Giving Falls Short. And the main thing is control. And that's why we struggle to react and respond in crisis. Foundations have become obsessed with our institutions and living forever. Legacy, brand. It's nice to be a CEO. You get asked to speak on panels, the best places. If you took away the foundation from behind my name, I don't know if anyone would ever want to hear me. I'd probably just be some ranting guy in the corner. So it's a beautiful thing when you have these big institutions. The problem is we're not set up right now to respond in a moment like this really well. We have a lot of barriers in front of us. We have 95% of our assets tied up in hedge funds and venture funds, speculative enterprises where these fund managers are not quick to give up that money. When you hand it to them and say, hey, earn 10, 15% on this for me, and now you're in a crisis, going to them and saying, oh, can I have it back really quickly? I want to help people. They're like, no, we want to harm people. We're going to do that. We're not going to do the help people part. It's challenging. We divested completely 5 years ago from everything that makes money. And it was a real project. Certainly, it could not have been in the midst of crisis. So you've got that situation, and that's all because we're trying to live forever. If we didn't want to live forever, we wouldn't have to have our funds invested in things that are going to make the world worse so that we can earn more. So that's a huge issue that we have to grapple with. Responding in this time means that you have flexible capital ready to go and none of these barriers in front of you. You need to be in a place where you're putting humanity before perpetuity, not the other way around. So at Stupski, we're not in that situation. We are a spend down. We're going to disappear in about a year and a half as a grant-making entity. And last year, when we were looking at the situation, my entire program team looked at the situation and said, well, we were intending to move about 25% of our assets for grant making. We decided to move 70. I mean, it was really clear to us that we would see a report from Elisha in a year that would tell us that foundations need to move right now. And that was a year ago. So my team moved. And as a result, we're closing sooner. But who cares? I mean, no one needs Stupski around. We're going to be gone. The money is what people need. And I wish more foundations would take that attitude and think back to like the beginning of why they came into existence. It was likely one major grant made to a non-existent organization that was made something into a foundation where the money got housed, and then teams were built and institutions were built and brands were built. And every time any one of those things happens, the barriers get put up in front of moving money. And that is really all that any of these reports are asking for. We're asking for the money to move. And we in the foundation sector have put up a lot of controls around that. And I think that the one trend I hope to see in response to these threats that are coming in fast and furiously is that this sector will be much more reflective on how we are showing up and act on it. Move from being from a place of excessive donor control over to one of greater community engagement. And there are hundreds of people on this call right now that could help foundations do that. And that's what my hope is, because that's the only way we're going to see the amount of capital necessary to respond to these problems happen. If we continue to hoard it, it's not going to be used for the things that are needed. We're just going to continue to see these problems compound.
I can see a lot of appreciation for your comments, Glenn. But I think one thing that underscores all of this desire for maybe changing what's happening right now is about trust and the fragility of trust in the sector. That's one thing that our report pointed to, but how can we build that trust? How can we build those relationships to either move more money or restore some of what's been lost or harmed?
Is that to me?
It's for all three of
Okay,
you.
I'll
So
step back. I just spoke too long.
I'm happy to jump in real quick. So
sure.
I think there's a couple things about trust in the sector, and I want to go back to another like force or trend that I didn't mention in the beginning, and that's the decline in participation in giving in the US. So, with dollars are up, overall dollars are increasing, but the number of folks giving and volunteering and participating is declining, and it has been for over 10 years. This is a huge worry for all of us, right? Because having a broad and diverse donor base in our country is so important. It's good for nonprofits because it means that they have more supporters, more volunteers, more champions, more fundraisers, and that a broader number of organizations and causes are supported. But it's also good for our democracy. There's this research from the Do Good Institute at University of Maryland that came out in like 24, I think, that shows this direct tie between going to the polls and giving and volunteering. If you give, you're more likely to go to the polls. If you volunteer, you're more likely to go to the polls. So this is like a civic health issue. And so I tie this to trust because I think if people aren't actively giving and they're not in those relationships or actively volunteering, you have this othering, this distance between our organizations and ourselves. And so it weakens trust. And I think our sector has done a lot of head things to build trust. So we have ratings, we have impact, we have numbers, and I'm a fan of those things. Believe me, like I believe actually in like measures of effectiveness, but that never works on its own, right? People give with their heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to speak more to that heart, and we've got to work on our storytelling. We have to work on reframing kind of the sector and what it means and to show people the power of how nonprofits are all around them. I think the NCN campaign last year, those messages are along the right lines. It's just how do we get them out much more broadly? And how do we build those pathways to engagement to make it easier for people to give? Glenn was talking about the barriers. We've got to reduce the friction for individuals as much as we do for foundations. And so I think that's a big part of the trust piece.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I have one other thought. I was just thinking too on the trust piece. One of the ways that we build trust in interpersonal relationships, right, is we take risk for one another. So, for instance, I was talking with a friend the other week and she was telling me about another friend. I was like, well, how'd you meet? And she told this story about it was raining and they couldn't find her keys and they were searching in the rain together, right? Like they took, there were risks taken on both sides. I'll take the risk to get wet. Like there were risks taken by both sides to then end up being in closer relationship. And one of the things that our data showed when I talked about those disconnects between the questions was this disconnect between funders, how willing funders think they have been to take risk, far outweighed what nonprofits saw as funders that their whether they've been taking risk or not. And I think some of the trust issue is because sometimes when we talk about risk, we're not talking about the same risk, right? Like one person's thinking about maybe legal risk or financial risk or what will happen to my endowment or not. And the other party's thinking about, I'm at risk of not being able to serve food to 5,000 people in the next month, right? So I think there are some conversations that need to happen in terms of building trust across the sector, just within the sector, around the willingness to take risk and like whose risk we're talking about and what we mean when we say that. And so I think taking risk is an important part of building trust.
But what I hear both of you saying really relates to sort of bridging some divides and bridging some kind of binary stances that are longstanding in our field. I see several questions in the chat around what action or advice do you recommend, whether it's creating conversation between funders and nonprofits, or addressing kind of these larger pressures on civil society. Um, what can we actually do, either as individuals or organizational leaders? Help us see the path through the trees.
Well, one thing that I think there are lots of things that can be done, but one for sure is the National Council of Nonprofits campaign around the role that nonprofits play in communities, I think is extremely important because there are so many folks every day who are interacting with nonprofits and they're not necessarily making that connection that that's what's happening. And so I think one part of building trust is folks just being really out there and making people aware, like, you were at the library. Yes, that is part of the city. And like they're not, or the reading program in your local school, the after school program, that is a nonprofit. And so I think there's some work to be done around that piece. And I think the National Council of Nonprofits has some really great tools out there. I also think, on the funder side, there are lots of great examples too of folks who are standing up and being vocal and Glen, of course, is one. Marguerite Casey, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I think there are folks who are being bold and not only making statements, but to Glen's point, like putting their money where their mouth is, and doing that in partnership with folks in communities. And so I think there are examples definitely to draw on, in terms of actions that folks can take on both sides.
Thanks, Elisha.
I hate to put pressure on the the NGOs and we call the nonprofit sector, even though of course foundations are as well, but we won't get caught up in jargon too much. But really, I hate to put the pressure on the nonprofit side, but I will, because I think if it has not been made clear at the moment, I put plenty of pressure on my peers. So I'm just going to move it over to the nonprofit sector a little bit, which is I think the issue that we face around trust is that foundations are operating in a 5% giving environment. And as a result, there is an enormous amount, and has been for decades, deep deprivation in the nonprofit sector. Organizations are not receiving the funding they need to be strong and sustainable. And as a result, the statement, even though I don't think this is the intention of foundations, is it says we don't trust you. We trust our investment advisors more. We give them 95%. We give you 5%. And so I think that's a trust issue. And I think here's where I come back to the nonprofit sector. I know there's a power dynamic. I can't stand it, but it exists. And somebody's got the money, somebody doesn't have the money. But there are far more. There are over a million, I think, maybe even 2 million nonprofits in the United States. There are 150,000 foundations. Your combined muscle to turn to the foundation sector and say, this is not acceptable anymore. When a big foundation says we're giving away $100 million and they have 12 billion in their accounts and everybody likes it on LinkedIn, I think to myself, stop positively reinforcing this behavior. That is not acceptable. $100 million when you're sitting on 12 billion in a time like this is simply not acceptable giving, in my opinion. And so, but the likes flow, the praise flows, and of course it does, because we have to play this game. And it is a game. And I think that we all have a responsibility. This system exists as it does because we have allowed it to exist like this. We as Americans have said the richest people in the world should get to decide who's going to get what in society. And foundations have been that instrument for a very long time. These are public entities. When someone gives their money to a foundation, they are giving it to a separate organization from themselves. Even if they throw themselves on the board and think in their mind that it's their money, it's not their money. And we give them a generous, generous tax benefit to put it in these things. We have a say. And so we have to demand that of the foundation sector. We can't let them decide who gets what all the time. And I know that is a hard lift. I know many of you are rolling your eyes at me right now and saying, how do I go to a foundation and say, give me more? But I do think we have to be really clear about the damage that's done when the money stays in a hedge fund account and not in a important organization, so many that Elisha and Victoria have named today. No, we're not going to backfill government loss. It's impossible. You know, Elizabeth already made that clear, but there's so much that could be done. I mean, resilience, creativity, that doesn't exist in foundations. That exists in the nonprofit sector. And with double the amount of money, triple the amount of money than these organizations are currently living on, I know the dollar goes further. I've seen it. I've experienced it. And, you know, I'll give you an example of what can happen. At Stupski, we went into a spend down structure about 10 years ago. If we had stayed at a 5% payout, we would have moved $160 million during that time. We have instead moved over $600 million during that time. Now imagine if we were working on that level with my friends and peers who are in the billion plus category, how much money would be out there right now compounding in good outcomes instead of sitting in real estate speculation. So these are the things I think, if we want trust, it has to kind of go both ways. There has to be a clear statement from the nonprofit sector that this is not acceptable behavior from foundations. Foundations have to listen and respond in kind. And that is just my ongoing message here. I think we have to start speaking as a society about this, because these dollars are not, you know, Elizabeth, you mentioned we only have $2 trillion. We can't backfill everything. We are in the midst of a major transfer of wealth. In the next 25 years, these funds are going to grow from $2 trillion to $18 trillion. That actually is 2 budget cycles for the United States. Are Americans going to want to sit and look at that 18 trillion sitting there contributing to more of the problems in society, or are they going to want that money? And I have a feeling that if foundations don't start behaving like they see the crisis in front of them, Americans are coming for that money. They tried. This year. Excise taxes started to get talked about. We're going to hear about them a lot more if we don't start moving the money as it is intended.
I'll jump in real quick. Elizabeth, you said like how to get through the trees, and it's hard, right? It's really hard to lift up right now. And Glen, I love the speaking truth to power to foundations. I think when we look at the big picture, foundations are one part of that capital stream, right? So that's the first thing. And I speak as a nonprofit leader, right, who has no endowment or anything else and used to be on the foundation side. So, you know, living what it feels like to be a nonprofit, and you got to look at all the revenue streams. Again, there's not going to be one silver magic bullet. So yeah, maybe get some more from foundations. Keep an eye on the public funding. Hey, as citizens, you know, may not feel like we have a lot of levers at the moment, but I'm not giving up on that. Like, let's stay active politically to ultimately kind of shape public funding streams, individual giving, everyday donors, money online, high net worth donors through DAFs. We got to look at that. And you know, this isn't appropriate for all nonprofits, but are there fees you can generate? Is there revenue you can generate from what you do that can give you a different kind of funding stream? So doing that kind of scenario planning right now is really important. And the way I've been trying to get through this as a leader is with the head and the heart. So with the head, I'm a total scenario planner, right? I want plan A, B, C, D. I like drive my staff crazy because I really want to kind of like make sure I can be ready for whatever's coming. And there's been a lot of threats, as we've referred, and you got to be ready for those, even if they don't pan out. On the heart piece, for me, it's about the nonprofits we partner with. So we work in Ukraine, Syria, Gaza, Afghanistan, Pakistan. You know, we're working in incredibly hard places. These folks are dealing with things that are way harder than we have been dealing with in the US. And they've been dealing with them for decades. And they don't give up on the work. And it doesn't matter how much money they have. This is their community. These are their people. These are their neighbors, their family, themselves. And you just keep doing the work. And that inspires me so much when I'm freaking out about what I saw on the news or what I just heard from the council and foundations. You know, I really lean into like folks who've dealt with threats from their government for a long, long time, and they still find ways to operate. I think it was Glen who talked about the creativity of the nonprofit sector. We got to really lean into that right now and be there for each other. I'll also say, like, foundations made a pledge to stand up for one another, if they get attacked. Be nice if nonprofits did that too. I can see us kind of retreating into our cause areas because some causes are more vulnerable than others. Some geographies, they're being picked off one by one around this country. That's not good. We really do have to stick together as a sector. So that's important. And I kind of look to the council, National Council of Nonprofits and independent sector to lead the charge on that one.
There's a great question here in the chat that I think is a nice follow on. When you look at these larger trends, what role do you all see as beyond the grant support in sustaining nonprofit organizations, especially as it relates to capacity building, focused on individual giving and sustainable fundraising support for organizations? So I guess what else can funders do beyond just the check, and what role can capacity building play? Did that come up in your research at all, Elisha?
It did. I mean, capacity building came up as one of the main when we asked nonprofits for what are the other kinds of things they're looking for from funders. Capacity building support was one of the big ones. And some of the reasons that people explained in the interviews for capacity building support were things like if you are, for instance, working with a coalition of organizations, maybe you need the infrastructure to do that. Or if you are thinking about a merger or an acquisition, to the point, one of the panelists made earlier, maybe you don't internally have the infrastructure to think through, what that looks like, what the best way to approach it is. So having capacity building support for that is really helpful. Other people in the interviews just talked about needing a space to meet for large groups, for coalitions of groups to meet, to do planning, to do organizing. And so capacity building was at the really near the top of the list for the kinds of things beyond the grant that organizations were looking for in this moment.
Yeah, and my switch from foundation world to nonprofit world, foundations have lawyers, or if they don't have them, they can pay them. and nonprofits often don't. And if they don't have them, they can't pay them. And even if they get some money to pay them, they can't find them, or it takes 6 months to find them because they don't have like a roster of legal counsel on in their Rolodex. That's how old I am. And so, funders can really provide recommendations. They can fund these kinds of things, scenario planning, legal support, absolutely convening, travel, the ability to attend conferences. Conferences are expensive, and it costs a lot to travel to them. And they're so valuable in moments like this. So there's so much that funders can do to support these kinds of things right now that are beyond the check. And I'd like to see more of that, frankly.
Well, not, you said beyond the grant, so I'll move outside the grant and focus on a different kind of capital. We have a benefit of being a spend down, so we've got every dollar not every dollar figured out, but every dollar charted out. We know when it's going to be gone. And so we know what we need, and we know when our doors close, and we know we're done. And about 3 years ago, we could really look out and see how much of our assets would be needed just in salaries. And that would end up sitting in a bank account because we didn't, like I said, we were completely divested from anything that would make money. So we were making money, though, because we had it in just treasury bills, savings accounts, things like that. So we realized it would be better if we didn't have it on our balance sheet and had it on someone else's balance sheet to earn interest. So what we did was we moved about, for us, a lot of money. For some of the foundations out there, it was just pocket change. But we moved about $25 million in no interest loans to community lenders. And we didn't think so much about the impact. We just thought it could be, one thing we thought was, look, if we move it without any interest on it and they accrue the interest, then that would be good for their bottom line. We would just ask for the principal back, please, to pay salaries in 5 or 6 years. And the impact has been amazing. It has just been amazing. These institutions that are typically trying to tread the line between the interest they're paying to a lender and the interest they are receiving from their clients makes that a really complicated environment, especially when you're dealing with clients who really don't have a lot of capital to part with. It's hard for them even to get the loans in the beginning. Giving no interest money is incredibly powerful. I cannot say enough about it. And I mean, it just puts a smile on my face to think about. I'll just give an example. We work in Hawaii where there is a real problem over there with land that's available to Native Hawaiians. It's in a lottery. And when people get the land, it's completely unsupported. It has no sanitation, it has no water, it has no electricity. So it's really difficult to put up a home there. It's certainly difficult to get a loan to put up a home. And we worked with a partner over there. We didn't even have an intention for this. We just said, hey, we'll give you one of these low, no interest loans. And he mixed it with commercial capital and made the money available to families that could now put a house on this land. 15 families put homes on this land. And again, I didn't go into it saying we have to get 15. We didn't even think about it. We just said, let's get it off our balance sheet to someone else. Honestly, I could retire on that news alone right there. And maybe I will. But the main thing is that you can do amazing things. You don't, if you are concerned about losing that money and you want it in your bank account, and I know like community foundations and other asset holders get worried about their balance sheets coming down and how that's going to look on the business environment. It doesn't have to come down, and you can still have it going to good use instead of harmful use. So I think that's another way to go beyond the grant that has not been. I thought it was an area that had been overexplored. I kind of thought the PRI thing had been there, done that. But I was stunned as someone who's also been in this a long time to see just taking interest off of it became a whole new game. And really exciting. And I hope more foundations would think about divesting out of harm, making the capital available, handing it over to a nonprofit to use for 10 to 15 years, getting it back when you need it later.
Well, I want to ask one more question around people and sustainability. So we know the environment has not been a kind one, whether it's government funding disruptions, threats to even donor safety, burnout. These all point to a sector that's under incredible pressure. So, how do we protect ourselves without abandoning the work? What strategies are you using to balance both the urgency of the moment and the sustainability, both organizationally and personally? Elisha, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I mean, I would say, from my perspective, it feels like and this is just my personal perspective, but it's a privilege to be able to do this work at this moment from this particular seat, right? Like, um, I feel like our job, the team that I sit on as CP, our job is to like lift up what's happening in the sector so that it's not invisible. And that feels like a real privilege, right? Because that's not the case for everyone. And so I think one thing for me is just like realizing and recognizing that. And then the other piece of it is that, and I talk with my team about this too from time to time, is just also like having space for the moments of joy when they do come, right? Because, life is still lifing all around us. They're having all personal kinds of life events that are joyful things. And so I think taking the time to celebrate those things, even in the midst of what's happening, right? And recognizing, to the point that was made earlier, and I love that point you made, Victoria, that like we aren't the first, we aren't the last. Like there are many who have gone through similar trials and tribulations. And so, just knowing that it is a really tough moment for our sector, and there are many communities from which we can draw lessons from which to learn how to navigate these kinds of moments.
For me,
Thank you.
I love the life keeps lifing. I'm gonna quote you, Elisha, because that it is true, right? How do you like zoom out? How do you zoom in? How do you protect those moments and like enjoy them in the face of everything? I think for me personally, part of it's about agency. This moment can feel overwhelmingly hopeless, and you can feel really disempowered, and just like there's nothing you can do, either for your organization or in your job or just like in life. And so, even though I'm got a big job, I volunteer I take time out. I'm involved in my community. I'm volunteering in DC. I'm politically active and I take time to do that. And, so that all of those things, even if it's something little, right, it makes me feel empowered. And so, for our organization, we've looked at how to give staff extra support, and how to kind of have space for the big things, the joyful things, and the hard things, like having moments and taking moments as the staff and really kind of bringing support to our employees. And that's kind of an ongoing thing that I do for myself and we're doing for our organization.
We have 5 promises that we've made to the communities we support. One of them is investing in wellness. So what's happened since we've made those 5, along with giving all of our assets away and other things, sharing power, my program officers have all really invested in understanding it, understanding wellness, understanding how to invest in it, and even how to facilitate it. So I really get a lot of joy. I have not been invited to one. I don't know what I create when I show up in the room. So I've not been invited to a wellness retreat, but there are lots of wellness retreats that are held by our program officers. Almost all of them have held one, either in Hawaii or in the Bay Area. And it's really amazing the stories that come back. And I encourage foundations to do this, to just give nonprofit leaders and the people who support them, anybody in a nonprofit environment, a chance to spend a couple of days doing nothing but caring for themselves and just, sound baths galore. Like everybody gets an opportunity to just be relaxed and massages and breaks. And, everybody initially comes in and they're guilty. They feel guilty. And it really goes to show you like where we come from in this sector. They feel guilty. Oh, I don't know if I should have this. After about a couple hours with some good facilitation, people loosen up and enjoy. And we've gotten so many, the program officers and the facilitators they work with have received a lot of really, very moving statements from leaders who just needed the 2 days, didn't even know they needed it, didn't know how much they were struggling, got over the guilt and could accept. And, the foundation world, we do this plenty. And I'm so proud of my team for coming up with this strategy and making it an important promise to the communities we work with. And I strongly encourage, again, use your voice, nonprofits, ask for it if they're not giving it to you, and foundations, please offer it. Your grantees need it. And these are the people who you're counting on for the impact you're trying to get out there.
I think that's all good advice for us to take back to our respective workplaces. I'm going to give you each one final word here. If someone walks away from this webinar and does just one thing differently tomorrow based on this conversation, what should it be?
Real quick, just stay engaged. Don't give up. It's really tough, but if you can find one thing to do to stay connected, sign up for a monthly gift to something you care about. It can be $5 a month. Carve out that space for volunteering. And again, it doesn't have to be something like really urgent. It can be just something regular in your community that you get joy from. Join a giving circle where you can connect with others. Just really kind of stay plugged in and don't tune out. You can tune out from the news as you need to. Don't tune out from each other and don't tune out from our communities.
Thanks, Victoria.
I'll take one from Elisha. I would say challenge yourself to take a risk that feels really uncomfortable for you. I've thrown my request on the table, which is take a risk to sit down with the program officer and say, I need more from you right now. I need a lot more from you right now. We need a lot more from you right now. Program officers, take a risk to go to your CEO and say, can you push the board to do something, for crying out loud, while they're enjoying their 4 meetings a year? Let's actually do something instead of reading grant reports. Let's move some money. I think we all need to find that place of extra risk. That's the world we're in right now. And it's uncomfortable for sure. And you might fail. In fact, you might fail every time you try. but there might be one time when you don't. It could change the lives of many people if you do.
Thank you, Glenn. Elisha, your final word.
Yeah, my final word would be, you know, it is to just activate around something. Maybe, and I think about, because I think a lot about, I have an 11-year-old son, and I think about everything that's happening right now, and I'm like, what kind of world are we creating that this generation is walking into? And so I would just say activate around something. Like in so many of our interviews, sometimes people would say, I feel powerless. I don't feel like I can do anything. I'm like, you can always do something. The way that some people say eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So I'm like, activate and do something. One thing, even if it's small.
Well, wise words from all of our panelists. Elisha, Victoria, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your perspectives, your wisdom, your encouragement for us to stay the course, for us to stay involved. And I hope that everyone can take something away from this as well as, begin reflecting on this new year that we're in, and helping our communities. I believe there's some information in the chat of how to follow and connect with the Johnson Center, so please subscribe if you haven't already. I believe we'll also be sending an evaluation out following this webinar as well as the recording. So again, with great thanks to each of you. Really appreciate it and good luck as we chart the course for this coming year.
Thanks for
All
having
right,
us. Goodbye, everybody.
take care.
Thank you. That was great. Take care.
Thank you.